I still have a great love for trains, especially steam engines. I used to get onto the Erie Railroad in Hamburg and watch freight and passenger trains go through town, and I just loved them. They were a breathing, living machine. When steam was dead in the New York area, around Buffalo, New York Central, and Erie quit steam in 1951, I started coming to Canada because the Canadian National and the Canadian Pacific were still running steam and did so in regular service up until 1958. One of the places I used to like to go to was Bayview. It's just north of Hamilton. There was a lot of action there with both freight and passenger trains. Most of the eastbound passenger trains would come down the hill, stop back into Hamilton around the bay to the station, load passengers, unload freight, express, and come back out around the bay and head for Toronto. The westbound trains would come down into Hamilton, and then they would back out around the bay and then proceed up the hill through Copetown and Dundas. The grade was probably 1%, and many of the heavier freight trains required helpers. They would double head the locomotives from Bayview up to Copetown. Mikados were usually the locomotives on the helpers, and the 61 and 6200 Northerns were the main freight engines. There were some local freight trains, and also Canadian Pacific used the line from Hamilton to Toronto. This is a consolidation on a local freight. He had probably made all the stops between Toronto and Hamilton. Here comes the Canadian Pacific. If you notice, the semaphores used for signaling are still installed here. The tower was a manually operated machine with big levers that the operator had to pull to change the indications of the signals. You can see some semaphores there on the left. That would be a pool train coming down to Hamilton and possibly even to Buffalo, New York Central TH and B combination. Sometimes the action got so heavy that you didn't even have time to load your camera. This is an eastbound train. He will shortly back into Hamilton on the tracks on the right. And another scene of a double-header freight going up the hill. Sometimes the engines would sit there on the siding for a couple of hours waiting for some trains to come by that would need their assistance. They used any kind of an engine. That one was a Pacific as a helper. And here comes an eastbound passenger train out, heading for Toronto. These days the maintenance was really good. The engines were clean and shiny and ran well. Here's another eastbound heading down into Hamilton. A little later he will back out and then go up the hill toward Copetown, heading for London. Here comes a light helper engine backing down to near Bayview Junction Tower, where he'll sit in that siding waiting for the next train to assist westward. Bayview Junction is kind of like a Y. The one line went around to Hamilton. The other line headed up the hill to the Niagara Escarpment. And there was a third track that came around that would allow the CP and CN trains to come directly out of Hamilton and head west. There goes a doubleheader, and he's really working. Thank God the engines had stokers. If they were hand-fired, the fireman really earned his money on those jobs. This is train 75. It did not go down into Hamilton, but stopped at Dundas. They were using the Canadian National Hudsons at the time, and later changed to the bullet nose 6000 series. It was a short train. It only went to London, but it did stop at, like I mentioned, Dundas. It was a little bit tough to start on the grade, and we'll see a view of that in a little while. You can notice now the signals have been changed to searchlight types and the semaphores are gone. They also changed the switch machines to electric operated, which are easier on the operator. All he had to do was push a button. This helper is backing down to assist the freight in the background. That's one of my friends running down to get a picture. Most of the rail fans I knew took slides and still pictures, but I like the challenge of taking movies. The only thing I wish is they were sound, because then it would be really super. This is at Dundas. This is a through passenger train, and he will not stop at the station. On this view, I stood up on the signal tower to get a little bit different angle. Here comes an engine with a car of crushed stone. It was a company just down the hill that had a quarry. I guess they used to sell a lot of crushed stone to the CN for ballast. They had a couple of sidings there, and they would put the cars in for storage. And of course, they could only do that when there weren't any trains coming by. We'll switch locations here. This is Niagara Falls. You can see a diesel unit in the background. They also had a roundhouse for servicing the steam engines. There's a view of the roundhouse and the engine backing out onto the turntable. A few of these locomotives were able to go into the United States. They did so on the Maple Leaf, the through passenger train that the Lehigh Valley would take down to New York City. The engines ran over to Suspension Bridge where the Lehigh put their diesel locomotives on. They had to meet all of the regulations of the Interstate Commerce Commission in the States to make sure that the boilers and other operating appliances were in order. There's nothing left of the roundhouse today. It's completely torn down. You wouldn't even know where it was located. You can notice there the old brick section and the newer wooden one that was in the process of being torn down because the need was slowly diminishing. This is at Merritton, Ontario, train bound for Niagara Falls. It was a connection point freight interchange with the Niagara, St. Catharines and Toronto Electric Railroad, a subsidiary of the Canadian National. The NRHS from Buffalo had many trips on the electric passenger service part of the Niagara, St. Catharines. There's one of their electric freight motors, probably rated about 500 horsepower. They did freight service. I think the electric was taken out of service about 1959. This is in Hamilton, just west of the passenger station down near the roundhouse. They had quite a large freight yard there. This engine is approaching the yards. It will stop and take water. It was kind of interesting. The water column was locked, and the fireman up on the tender tried to grab it with an iron rod and swing it over, put the water in the tender. You'll see he didn't have an opportunity to do so because the thing didn't turn. This is up near Toronto Union in Toronto. Canadian Pacific locomotive coming out to be put on a eastbound passenger train. That was a busy spot too, with all the eastbound and westbound passenger trains coming into and out of the Union Station, plus an occasional freight. Kind of can get a view of the Royal York Hotel before they put the addition on it. We spent a lot of time over near Hamilton, especially following the mixed freight and passenger trains that ran down to Port Dover and Port Rowan. This is a Sunday freight train, double header. The front locomotive will continue down after they get to Caledonia. Because of bridge restrictions, the other heavier engine couldn't do that, and it'll switch cars and possibly go to Fort Erie. This is at Caledonia, where the line split off. Much action occurred here because there were east and westbound passenger trains. They would exchange freight and mail express. They were using the Moguls those days, the 80 and 90 series engines, because of a bridge restriction. Here we are at a little town called Glanford for a meet. It's not good practice to stand between two trains passing like this, but I had to get the picture. This train had come down from Stratford and was on the way to Fort Erie. Now we're heading down the branch. You can see a few freight cars and a passenger coach at the end. There's a freight ready to follow us behind. It would make all the stops and service different industries along the line. We really had a good time on this train. The crew was very accommodating. When we got down to Port Rowan, one of the guys would get in the mail truck, ride into town, go to a store, buy a loaf of bread and some cold cuts, maybe a can of mustard, some pickles, go over to the brewer's retail, buy a case of beer, and we'd have a little party in the baggage car. A couple of times, and I suppose the Canadian National can't do anything anymore now, the engineer would go over and have a beer, the fireman would run the engine, and I would shovel coal. Not bad pay for a fun time of riding an engine. The train crew told us another interesting part about this line. The rails had been made in Sheffield, England. And the Gillette Razor Blade Company was just waiting for the line to be ripped up so they could get the rail to make Gillette blue blades. Evidently the steel was of a very high quality. We're here at Port Rowan putting the engine on the turntable to turn it around for the trip back. These engines were hand fired, so the fireman had to put coal in with a shovel, not stoker work like the other locomotives, more modern and larger ones had. They really rode rough. And the track wasn't that great either, so I don't suppose that helped any. It was hard to hold the camera steady. A raging inferno in there. When we returned to Simcoe, the train backed down the line to Port Dover. Here we are taking water at Lynn Valley. An engine like this would probably have a tender capacity of about 5,000 gallons of water and 6 tons of coal. Obviously enough for the whole trip as far as the coal was concerned, but not the water capacity. Here we are continuing to back to Port Dover. There was no freight in the Kansas that day, so we didn't do too much switching. Now we are on our way out. We're passing the Lake Erie and Northern Canadian Pacific subsidiary electric line that ran up toward Bradford. They supply daily service passenger trains down to Port Dover. After we got out to Simcoe, we got on the main line of the Canadian National branch, the Cayuga subdivision. The track was a lot smoother, and they probably ran the train about 40 miles an hour. Here we are swinging out onto the main. We are approaching the train order station. You notice the signal is at a 45 degree, which meant that you had to pick up a train order. The station agent is standing by trackside. They threw off a little mail, and he's got an order for the conductor. In the later 50s, they used heavier engines on the line. They must have strengthened the bridge. Here's a tower at Hagersville, and this is the New York Central, and I really didn't care for the diesels they were running, so it's a joke I did that. That tower now completely is gone. The Michigan Central became Conrail. The Canadian Pacific bought it, and it's being in the process of ripped up. It was a Canada Southern originally. Here we are at Jarvis. Loading express and mail. In the early days, these trains really did serve a purpose because the mail contract was a money-making thing for the railroads. When the mail system started delivering mail by truck, the railroads lost their contracts and most of these trains were discontinued. It was just a nice leisurely way to spend a day and have a little fun to boot. This was a little town on the way. Didn't stop here, but I remember my father bringing our family over to do some fishing. He was a great fisherman, and we stayed near there. This is the engine coming up onto the turntable at Port Rowan. They had to make sure the track was aligned so they didn't derail. There was a locking bar that would prevent the turntable from moving. And they would pull the locomotive up and get it to balance in the center point and then turn the turntable. I've seen some turntables that are hand operated. There's a big beam that they stick in it. Train crew pushes the engine around, but this one had a little air operated motor on it, a 2-cylinder engine, and it was a friction drive. There was a track around the outside of the pit. The one thing he was having trouble with is a lot of vegetation. You start crushing dandelion stems and it made the wheel a little slippery, and he may have been able to take care of that by moving the engine slightly to a little more pressure, but you can see they ran it off the brake system, the air system off the engine. You can see the hose going over to the brake. Now we'll pull down and pick the rest of his train up and head for Simcoe. I noticed the young boy there on his bicycle watching the train go by. Reminds me of my younger days. I did a lot of that. Hope he enjoyed the scene as much as I used to. We're coming into Caledonia. We'll stop, pick up orders, and then head down into Hamilton. You can see it took most of the day to do this. The sun's quite light in the sky in the west. The station agent giving us an order to back up. And here we are on our way. This is coming down Fergus Avenue in Hamilton. It was kind of interesting. They ran right down through the middle of the street. If you're driving a car, you had to be careful not hit the train. This is at Hamilton Station, a Niagara Falls bound train. The engine's backing up. In 1541 will be coming out to be put on the Hamilton to Port Rowan mixed. Before the bridge was built over the Welland Canal at St. Catharines, and we would come over to ride the train, we always hoped that the drawbridge on the QEW was not going to be up, so we missed the train. There's the Niagara Falls train departing. This was the last day of passenger service on the branch. This is Upper James. It's now an underpass. Those days it was a grade crossing. This is an eastbound freight at Caledonia. All of the big 6200s have been bumped off of passenger service. Passenger trains by now on the main line were pretty much dieselized, and so they were trying to run their time out on these engines in freight service. One of our railfan friends brought his girlfriend over to ride the engine for the last trip. In retrospect, we should have continued chasing this train south to Port Dover. Another friend of mine and I went up to Bayview Junction on the Canadian Pacific, and we did not see one steam train that day. This is the passenger train coming into Caledonia from Stratford on the way to Fort Erie. And again, they would exchange express and mail. And that's a way freight engine backing up there. It was quite a bit of action for such a little junction spot. Heading out of town. They must have had a great ride that day. Wonder how much beer they picked up in Port Rowan that afternoon. I remember reading the numbers on the tenders of those engines. It was something like 20 tons of coal, but it was like 12,000 imperial gallons. This is train 75 heading up the hill at Dundas. This is coming over the QEW on the Niagara Falls bound train. A friend of mine and I went over, and he was so excited that he threw his hat up into the tree. This is coming into Port Colborne. This track is now completely ripped up. They stopped briefly here, unloaded mail and express, and then continued on over the Welland Canal. There was a drawbridge immediately to the right. It's coming into Beamsville on the Niagara Falls line. And another shot at Dundas. In the distance you can see smoke from the switcher down at the crushed stone quarry. They had a big conveyor that came over and dumped the stone into cars. The 5700s had pretty high drivers, and it was an extreme difficulty to get that train started on the grade. This is at Grimsby. Now they bumped some of the 6200s off and they're using the bullet nose 6000s. They were newer engines and probably were in better condition. There's my car with a tape recorder in it. It's too heavy to carry around. It really wasn't portable by any means. This is a Canadian Pacific freight at Burlington. And a light engine at Burlington. .32 3252 was probably going to Toronto to either equalize motive power requirements or to have work done on the engine, Spadina. This is at the Spadina Roundhouse. They serviced engines here, lubricated them, added coal and water to the tenders, got them ready for passenger service. It wasn't that far from Toronto Union, and they would run them down there light Sometimes there were so many engines they got in the way of each other. Slipping drivers may have been caused by the fact that the track there had been a lot of oil spilled on it, slippery, or the engineer decided he didn't need the sanders. You'll probably head a train later in the day to Montreal. The steam coming out of the cylinders is to get rid of the water that would condense in the coal cylinders before they got warmed up from the steam. And if you didn't drain it out, you could punch out the front or rear cylinder head cover. And then, of course, the engine would be junk. Steam locomotives are very labor intensive. They had to have many people working on them. After a run of approximately 100 miles, they would need to be inspected. Mechanics would go around and hit the various mechanical moving parts with ball peen hammers to check for loose bolts. If it had a dull sound, they would know it was cracked. They had to do a lot of work on them. Not like your car where all you need to do is add oil and gas to it. These things had to be really checked over after every run. That train is probably headed for either Niagara Falls or London. This I consider to be the prime train of Canada, the Canadian, operated by the Canadian Pacific. This is a train coming in from Vancouver. It's in the afternoon. Beautiful streamlined train set. It had been diesel powered now for quite a number of years. There's another engine running down for a westbound passenger train. Be neat to be in a dome car and watch that steamer go by. And then of all things, here goes the westbound Canadian coming out. All in a time period of about a half an hour. I remember sometimes it got so thick and fast that you couldn't get movie camera film in your camera fast enough. Somewhat of a changed skyline in the distance there. No CN Tower and all the other things that they've added to downtown Toronto. It's a changing scene. Man, I sure love the old days. Here's a fairly light Pacific. It would be used on branch line trains. Probably weighed 100 tons. But it could handle 4 or 5 cars very nicely. They were very accommodating people around there. They wouldn't bother you, didn't ask for releases or anything. If you just stayed out of the way and were very careful. This man is washing down an engine with probably a caustic solution of hot water and steam to get the grease off so they could check for any worn parts. And of course makes the engine look nice too. And coal dust was somewhat abrasive to get rid of it. Made for a little bit longer life on the mechanical parts. There you can see the steam coming out of the cylinders on the bottom, just making sure that all the condensate is drained off so it doesn't create a problem in the cylinder. Water does not compress, and if the piston comes up to the end of the cylinder stroke and it's still in there, you could really have a serious problem. This is at Stratford, Ontario. That was where their main shops for this area of the country was located. They did major overhauls there, new boilers, running gear, take the wheels off, bore out cylinders, new flues, firebox sheets, did the whole thing. I guess a lot of people go to Stratford for the Shakespearean plays. I went there because of the steam engines. You can see them parked over in the back. A lot of them are out of service now because it's getting later in the 50s and the diesel had really made inroads. Every steam locomotive was different, even if they were the same type and similar numbers. They all had characteristics. Some were good steamers, some were bad. And I guess nobody ever figured out the reason. They just had individual personalities. These are a couple of earlier mountain type locomotives. One is 6034 and the other one is 6032. They were the CN's mainstay before they built the Northerns, the 6200s. They could either do good service in either freight or passenger trains. They're switching cars at the station in Stratford. Probably one would go directly to Toronto and the other one would come down through Bradford. This train is approaching Palmerston. It came off of one of the branch lines. And will meet other trains there and continue on its way. There were a number of trains coming up from Stratford. The Palmerston was quite a large division point. They had a roundhouse. Here the 1532 is coming onto the turntable, and it looks like the roundhouse crew has spent their extra time polishing the engine. Of course, cleanliness does indicate good maintenance. A large facility there for servicing locomotives. Hostler is putting the spout down in the tank to fill it full of water. This engine probably had come up on an earlier train from Stratford. It's quite a large Pacific. This is a station in Palmerston. It is still standing today. There was a hotel behind it, and it's been since torn down. This is the arriving passenger train mid-morning from Stratford. I had an interesting happening here. We bought round-trip tickets to Owen Sound, and of course the station agent gladly sold them to us. We didn't realize until later that the train going up to Owen Sound does not arrive there until after the other train coming south has left. So we paid an extra $1 or $2 to the railroad and couldn't ride the trackage. (1532) is now backing around the station to go on another branch line off to the west. I was here in 1956, and you wouldn't even know the area exists. Kind of an interesting location with tracks on both sides of the station. We are now departing for Owen Sound. That engine will come ahead for pick up some cars for a local freight. You can see the diesels behind the engine have come up from Stratford with a freight. They are slowly making their inroads. Big water tank, and they need a lot of water for steam locomotives. And here we are headed north. Pretty good farm country up there. Looked like dairy farms and things like that. And we're going into the Canadian Pacific branch here, up near Hanover. If you could pose the train and the horse and buggy together, it would be like a 1920s picture. (1525) is getting ready to take a train up to Wyerton. It was a branch line that ran from Parkhead off to the northwest. In the meantime, the other train will depart for Rowan Sound. Friendly wave from the mailman. Two cars, hardly worth the bother. And of course this track is out of service now. I think there was some talk of having a short line operator run it, but I'm not sure what the outcome of that was. This is the Wyerton train, and there's also a diesel unit in the back. If you notice, the 1525 has inside valve gear. There are no extra rods on the side by the wheels. It was called Stevenson Lincoln. It was an early development of the steam engine. Classic little combine car, mail compartment in the front, coach system in the back. This is the down train from Owen Sound, which, as I mentioned before, left before the train had arrived there, so you could not do a complete round trip. The facilities at Parkhead were somewhat unique. They used an old coach for both the waiting room and the station agent's office. And again, they did some switching, interchanging the cars. This is a Niagara Falls train at Jordan. You can see this bridge from the QEW. I'm standing on an abutment of an older bridge that had been relocated. It's quite obvious in this picture, in the foreground. More action at Bayview. This is a double-header freight coming around, going into the Hamilton yard. Notice the signals. They're no longer semaphores, but the searchlight signals. And the interlocking machine in the tower is now electric. The engines, too, are getting a little more grimy. The effort's not spent needlessly on cleaning, but on required maintenance. And they still had cabooses those days. There's an occasional one now, but most trains have a rear end device that tells the engineer by radio what the brake pressure is, so he knows when the train breaks in half. Another westbound passenger train is probably 75, which does not go into Hamilton. He's got that grade ahead of him, and he's really opening her up. Another sequence at Dundas. Fairly long freight train, although he does not have a second engine. Looks like a ballast train, probably heavier than heck. This is at Hamilton, the 6404, streamlined engine for the Royal train in 1939, is coming out with a train bound for Toronto. We're on the back end of a train going from Hamilton up to Georgetown, continuing on up the branch to Barrie, and then over to Collingwood and Meaford. The Canadian Pacific comes under that bridge from Aberdeen Yard, parallels the CN, swings off west and goes up to water down to Guelph Junction, and also has trackage rights on the Canadian National between that point and Toronto. We expected to have the homemade diesel electric on this passenger train today, but the CN put a steam engine on, Pacific. This is near Burlington. That freight will follow us up, stopping at all the stations, switching boxcars into customers' sidings. Here's one for the books. The QEW at grade. That is now completely different. There's all kinds of overpasses and the road has been relocated further north. We're coming into Georgetown, another typical junction point on branch lines where the trains would stop, interchange baggage, freight. That's crossing the Canadian Pacific at Milton. He's blowing foam and dirt out of the boilers to avoid foaming action, which can be dangerous to the cylinder lubrication. This is a train from Stratford, eastbound toward Toronto. 5611. That engine was pictured on the front cover of a Trains magazine sometime in the mid-50s. It was a real nice article in there, and it got me interested in these places up in Ontario. And 6014 is bringing a train in from Toronto. Man there with a baggage wagon. Our train now is backing out, and we'll continue up the branch to Barrie. Terracotta. I guess they had a brick company there once. Kind of some unique places. There's Cheltenham. A lot of times they just threw off the mail in the sack. Didn't make a stop. This is coming into Allandale. They had a roundhouse here for engine servicing. The branch went to Collingwood and Meaford from here. There's an 080 switcher, the 7400 series, switching cars. We met a fellow rail fan here, came up from Toronto on the North Bay train. It was a nice summer day, as I remember, quite warm. The switch engine will take cars off the back of the North Bay train and switch them over into the yard for pickup and be taken up to Collingwood. 1533 is headed that way. Here's the 080 with another passenger car. Well, we're leaving Barrie, actually Allandale Station here. Barrie's around the lake. Nice paint job on the station at Angus. This is over near Camp Borden. Both the Canadian Pacific and the Canadian National served Camp Borden back when they did troop movements by train. And we're coming into Collingwood. They did a lot of shipbuilding here for the Great Lakes trade. Still some factories and big cranes. I imagine they do dry dock service now. We turned the train on a Y and are backing into Meaford. It was a stub end track. It stopped right by the lake, Georgian Bay. What a beautiful place for a station, right out by the lake. If you had a little free time, you could take a run in, put your swimming trunks on, and take a bath. We didn't stay here very long, though. A couple of minutes. It's a really beautiful country up there. I know in later years there was a group that wanted to run a train service on this. They're now in Tottenham, and I think the people up at Craigleith and a couple other spots didn't want smoky, dirty steam engines running by their houses all the time, so they never were able to make an agreement. How about that? Utopia. Best place in Ontario. The world, for that matter. (1533) is now being removed from the train. We're back in Allandale. It'll go down to the roundhouse for servicing. They put the train back together with a couple more cars from North Bay, and we'll be soon heading down to Hamilton. Our friend had to depart here and go back to Toronto on the North Bay to Toronto train, which is arriving right now. They sure were getting their miles out of the low 6,000 numbers. But it was a nice engine and good enough for a passenger train for what they were getting out of it. Not too heavy. Probably not more than about 8 cars. Stoker fired, so the engineer didn't have to work too hard. I mean, the fireman. Looks like they're having a confab there. They did not change crews here. I don't know what the limits were. We're not that far. Usually it was 100 miles. Well, we're leaving Allandale. Going back down the branch. We'll stop at Georgetown. Nice view of Lake Simcoe. This is the 401 at grade crossing. They later built a bridge for the road over the top of the tracks and now the tracks are abandoned. This was a way freight coming north. Some interesting locomotives in its consist. There was a power shortage out in Alberta and Manitoba, and they had converted these steam engines, that's a consolidation type 2600, to oil burners. There was no coal out there. An 080 switcher engine, an 83 series, and then a low 6000 number. 6060 was also converted to oil and spent some time out there before being retired at the park in Jasper. And of course it came back for Toronto in the 80s for steam excursions. An old, long, unused coaling tower. I think the tracks up to the top have been removed. We're coming now into Georgetown. There's a train headed for Toronto. In the distance, the locomotive's over there. 5125, Light Pacific, has been the engine for us coming down from Allandale. And again, there's some action. Another train coming in from Toronto headed towards Stratford. Fireman's up on the tender ready to take water. And here comes the semi-streamlined 6404. As I mentioned earlier, it was a locomotive used on the Royal train in 1939. This is at Georgetown on another day, a westbound passenger train for Stratford. You started to see the same engines in a number of different locations. Quaint little station there too, nice. They would pull down and interchange cars. This is arriving from Stratford toward Toronto. A heavy 53 series Pacific. And here comes our streamlined favorite, the 6404. I have to mention that they used to run a train at night from Toronto down through Hamilton to Niagara Falls. It left about 11:30 and usually had the 6404 in one car. Whether it was for crew deadheading or some other obligation, I'm not sure, but a big engine like that for one coach. Always planned to ride it and never did. Pretty well shiny there. wonder if it fell out of place. It usually was in service between Toronto and Montreal on those high-speed jabs that would rip off 80 miles an hour. This is the home-built diesel electric that we had planned on riding earlier in the summer from Hamilton up to Barrie, and then over to Meaford. But the day we had it was the steam engine. I never did ride behind it, but it's kind of an unusual machine. Obviously, it didn't require a fireman. It was powerful enough to haul itself in 2 coaches. They were probably very light trailers. Thank goodness there were no steep grades on the line. Reminds me of the Uri Doodlebugs that they used to run through Hamburg. Few passengers in the train. Must have been worthwhile. This is an engine backing out of the roundhouse up at Allandale. They did that for us. It was Labor Day weekend, 1958. Now we're at Paris Junction on the main line between Toronto and London. The 6200 is heading a westbound passenger train here. The tower operator is handing up orders. One set for the engine crew and one set for the conductor. It might tell him of a pending meet down the line, or possibly a slow order due to track work. Something that they had to know about, because these days there were no radio communications between the dispatchers and the tower operators and the train crew. We're standing next to the coaling tower at Paris Junction. Here's a westbound freight approaching. The fireman's up on the tender. He's going to take a load of coal. Now you can start to tell, though, that the maintenance has slightly dropped off. The engine's pretty grimy. No doubt it's in good operating condition, but appearance leaves a little bit to be desired. A little bit further west of Paris Junction, another 6200. In fact, the first of its class. It's one of the bullet nose 6000s. This is at Beamsville, I think. I took so many scenes you kind of lose track after a while, but it was a great opportunity. I love doing it every minute. This is another nice scene in the evening. It indicates that the days of steam are about to end. sequence of a train coming into London. They'd probably been out switching on the line all day long, servicing various industries. London is where they scrapped steam engines. They had a reclamation yard there. They would save all the usable metal. This is a shot of 6076, one of the Bolt-Nose Mountains. It was obviously they had some catastrophic failure. What happened, in my estimation, is that a lubrication failure took place. The bearing seized, the rods broke off the crank pins, the flailing rods took off parts of the firebox valves. I would imagine that the train came to an abrupt halt, because that does not happen unless you're going at high speed. Both sides showed devastating damage. Crank pins were broken off on the third driver. That engine never ran again. And here's an eastbound 6200 leaving London for Toronto. After steam was done, the Canadian National and the Canadian Pacific ran a few fan trips in the 60s. This is engine 6167, a 484 Northern, on a fan trip up to Barrie. In the wintertime, it was fabulous to take train movies. I feel very fortunate that I was a part of the steam era, because to see those beautiful engines and all of their sounds and scenes is just, it was too good to miss. This we're pacing along up near Bradford, north of Toronto. A friend of mine was sitting in the passenger side, and I gave him my movie camera. He shot this out the window. He's no longer with us, but it's a fitting tribute to him. His name was Jack Collins. Great rail fan.